Mr. Chairman, it is my great pleasure to be invited to give a talk at this conference held in honor of Professor Federico Sabina. And today I will give an overview of simple but very important ideas in multi-scale asymptotic modeling of elastic contact. This picture, photograph of gecko, very amazing living creature, very famous now due to its ability to move along vertical walls. And it is achieved due to adhesion. This adhesion is dry adhesion. Many researchers investigated this phenomenon, and it was established that the root of this phenomenon is in multi-scale structure of gecko's foot. So this picture is macroscale, microscale, and nanoscale. You see that when we zoom on one scale to another scale, the structure is to be generated anew. And so what we have? We have 1, 2, 3 characteristic lengths, and these lengths generate 2 non-dimensional small parameters. So, in order to explain the ability of gecko, it was introduced the concept of contact splitting. Many factors contribute to this phenomenon. And in particular, the size effect due to surface to volume ratio, when we consider a number of very small contacts and compare with large contact. So adhesion properties change due to this effect. But in my talk, I will consider only non-adhesion contact, and for the simplicity, it will be Hertzen contact. The concept of contact splitting is based on GKR, Johnson-Kendall-Roberts theory of adhesion, and this theory is based on Hertzen contact. So, this slide presents the fundamentals of Hertzen theory. We have 2 elastic bodies in contact, in local contact. We can say, for simplicity, this is 2 spheres of different elastic properties. And for our consideration, it is important to consider this relation between contact F and contact approach. This is nonlinear relation due to the change in geometry. When we press 2 bodies, contact area changes, and so we have nonlinearity. Hertzen theory of elastic contact is based on several assumptions. And among these simplifications is the assumption that surfaces are very smooth. However, in engineering it is well known that when we put very smooth surface under a microscope, we will see that actually perfectly smooth surface at macroscale, at microscale become rough. And so, after Hertz, a lot of efforts was done in order to model contact of rough surfaces. Apparently, one of the first particle models to model contact of rough surfaces was suggested by Kragelsky and Demkin. This is actually not very well known model, and it was generalized account for different factors that play a role in rough contact. So, very important factor in this theory is the distribution of asperities. It is assumed that each asperity in contact is modeled based on Hertzian theory. And a very crucial consideration is that asperities do not interact between themselves. Well, so we have two functions, eta and phi. First function can be measured in experiment, and this function is used in theoretical calculations. And it was shown by me that two functions are related by fractional derivative. Also, it was pointed out that this dimensionless parameter has a fractal property. Actually, it describes fractal properties of rough surface. To illustrate the previous model, let me briefly consider much more known Greenwood-Williamson model of rough contact. It is based on probability considerations. However, this model has a drawback that equation that relates contact approach and contact pressure is singular. But this theory is also analytical, and due to this drawback and some other peculiarities of the model, a lot of recent research was made on the theory of rough contacts. And in particular, the research group in France develops an approach based on numerical calculations, and this approach is just another point of view on the same problem of rough contact. I would like to emphasize that time needed to calculate contact between rough elastic surfaces is huge, even for modern computers. That is why analytical methods still play a very important role in investigation of this phenomenon. This picture shows the phenomenon of clustering of rough contact. This question was investigated in collaboration with Professor Igor Sebastianov, And our research was based on Greenwood's very important contribution to this field. And Greenwood considered the concept of Holm radius. Holm was a German electrical engineer who considered a cluster of microcontacts and described contribution due to interaction between microcontacts in terms of Holm radius. His consideration was based on an example of circular cluster, and in this case, Holm radius approximately coincides with the radius of cluster. However, when we come to clusters of different shapes, the concept of Holm radius should be generalized, and we did this. And in particular, very amazing finding was that cluster shape function same as that for elliptical punch. The previous example of cluster of microcontacts assumed that all asperities are situated on the same level. However, in rough surface, asperities are located on different levels, and they will receive different displacements. In order to describe this, new approaches should be developed, and this approach is based on the method of matched asymptotic expansions. I personally was induced into the world of asymptotic methods by my teacher, Professor Nazarov, and since then I use method of matched asymptotic expansions for different problems because this method allows us to highlight physics, mechanics of the problem. In particular here, in this equation, the first term comes from local interaction of asperities. And the second term describes their interaction. And due to the fact that asperities are located in different heights, we have got a nonlinear problem which is reduced to a variational inequality. So, when we come to consider real contact problems, actually we have multi-scale structure, and we consider macro level, micro level, and nano level. So, in order to describe this structure in terms of asymptotic models, we introduce two small parameters. And these small parameters are based on characteristic lengths of the real contact. In order to apply asymptotic method, we introduce stretched coordinates. The idea of stretched coordinates comes back to Prandtl and is very useful in constructing asymptotic approximations. So, if we consider a cluster of microcontacts, assuming for the simplicity that all asperities are located on the same level, we can apply homogenization method. And the corresponding solution was developed in collaboration with Professor Taras Melnik from Ukraine. And this problem, due integral characteristic of contact sport was introduced, and it is called generalized capacity of the contact sport. It comes from the boundary layer, which is constructed as a solution for a certain periodic problem. And this capacity is related to harmonic capacity asymptotically according to this formula. And if the size of the contact sport compared to the size of the cell comes to 0, this characteristic becomes singular, and another approach should be developed. So, now we consider a cluster of small contacts, but now we assume that we have large number of contacts, but they are very small. So we have interplay between two parameters, number of contact sport and relative size of the contact. And when we solve this problem, we arrive at this integral equation of the boundary layer. And this equation corresponds to the theory of Marchenko-Hruslov for Ukrainian mathematicians. And what is very interesting in this equation, that this term appears when we enlarge contacts. And on the contrary, when contacts become very small, we can neglect this term, and so we get Neumann boundary condition. So one limit case is Dirichlet boundary condition, the other limit case is the Neumann boundary condition. So this is somewhat intermediate case, and this asymptotic model describes the phenomenon of saturation of the contact interaction. So this slide presents the situation when we have densely packed circular clusters, which can be modeled as a number of small cracks inside circular contact. And it is very interesting that contribution from the cracks due to variation area when we introduce small openings is of the same order of magnitude as the contribution from the variation of the boundary. So, I come to the summit of my presentation, and let us consider very important practical problem of evaluating properties of composite materials. Up to now, we assumed that properties did not change when we come from one scale to another scale, from one level to another level. However, in reality, properties may change, and we should take into account this phenomenon. So, this photograph shows the surface of some composite material. And actually, for the simplicity, we will talk about matrix and inclusions. Okay. If we are interested in properties at the nanoscale, we can measure these properties using atomic microscope indentation technique. And due to the fact that properties vary when we move across the surface, we need to use many indentation to cover some representative surface of the sample. And this technique is called grid indentation testing. So these triangles shows indents of indenter pyramid, and making indentation, we can measure incremental indentation stiffness. However, when we move across the surface, we obtain different values, and this is due to the fact that properties of the material change. So, the question is, we have measured data about indentation, and now the question is how we can extract properties of composite materials. Very important to emphasize that, for example, for cementitious composites, some phases do not exist outside composite. They are created during the composite, and so actually very often we don't know the properties of the composite material phases, and so we cannot evaluate effective properties because we don't know properties of the phases. And indentation is used to evaluate these properties. So we formulate the inverse problem of calculating properties of the individual phases based on indentation. And a very important contribution to this problem was given in our joint work with Professor Sabina, published this year, and it is based on solution of small-scale indentation of a spherical inhomogeneity in elastic substrate. And cut the long story short, these two pictures show the behavior of asymptotic constants, A0. This asymptotic constant bears all information about geometry of the inclusion and interface conditions, boundary conditions at the interface between inclusion and matrix. These two cases differ by the relative properties of matrix and inclusion. Here, inclusion is more stiff. Here, on the contrary, matrix is more stiff than the inclusion. Dashed lines correspond to the solution when inclusion represents elastic layer. So, you see that the behavior is very similar, and now we can say that when inclusion can be represented as elastic layer, we have already solved the inverse indentation problem in our previous publications. And now when we come to this problem and using this project formula, we can solve inverse problem of identification of material properties, of course, under some usual assumptions that are made in indentation testing, and in particular in the theory of Oliver and Farr. So, let me come to my conclusion. Instead of matched asymptotic expansions is very useful to study multi-scale problems. If we consider 3 levels, we need at least 2 small parameters. These parameters are of geometric nature. They are just ratio of characteristic lengths. So, spreadsheet coordinates are used to zoom in, and when we introduce spreadsheet coordinates, we change our differential equations and change respectively the model that we use for the corresponding level. Inhomogeneity introduces new parameters, and the problem becomes more difficult. And a lot of work should be done in this direction. So I advocate for asymptotic modeling approach because this is a very useful mathematical method and tools. Thank you for your kind attention.
Are there any questions? Well, if there are any questions, we thank the speaker. We thank the speakers of all day. Thank you very much.